Welcome back to the January edition of Conversation with Archbishop Kurtz. And we have a treat today because we have a wonderful person to interview. It's Chris Graney. Chris, thank you so much for being here. Let me tell the audience a little bit about you. Chris and his wife, Christina, are members of St. Louis Bertrand Parish. He has 2 children. But Chris is also an astronomer on the team of the Vatican Observatory, a very interesting area. And so we have a lot of things to talk about in just 9 minutes. Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having me here.
Thank you. And thank you for your friendship now that I guess expands a little over 3 years ago. Tell our audience about the dialogue of faith and science that you and I have been engaged with other people and what brought us together in friendship.
All right. Well, what brought us, the person who brought us together really is Professor Jerry Williger at the University of Louisville. I believe 3 years ago was about the time of the total solar eclipse that passed through southern Kentucky. And as I recall, he contacted you about coming to a talk or something like that, and you couldn't make the talk, but you said to him, hey, let's get together and talk about faith and science. And he quickly snagged a couple of other astronomer-type people who he knew were Catholic, me and Tim Dowling at the University of Louisville. And so we began to meet, and before long, it's like we realized, there's more to science than just astronomy, and we brought in Kate Belinsky from Bellarmine University, and then later on, Fathers Dolan and Fichtenman, who had science backgrounds. And there was a little hiatus while you were ill, but we've been talking about these different things.
Well, it's been a joy for me to be involved in it. I remember our first gathering. I call it a dialogue of faith and science, and I remember suggesting, why don't we take up the document by St. John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, which brings together really faith and science. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was such a productive conversation. And of course, it gave me a chance to learn even more about science and to learn about the faith that people of science bring with them so often. Mm-hmm. And something that I think it qualifies as one of the best untold stories in our culture right now, especially with people thinking that there's some false division between faith and science. Now, you're trying to correct that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your involvement with the Vatican Observatory, and also you're writing some articles for the Record.
Yeah, I guess it's been a little more than a year now, maybe 18 months. Martin McAllister asked if I would write a column every other month, so it's 6 times a year. For the Record. We gave it the title "Science in the Bluegrass."
Yeah, I like that.
And it's about science. It also will have relate to science in particular in the local diocese in the church, and then with the Vatican Observatory. That's a too long of a story for 9 minutes. Yeah. But I'm an astronomer. I am on the staff of the Vatican Observatory. I'm in what's called an adjunct. The full-time people are all Jesuits. Well, they're not all Jesuits. They're mostly Jesuits. I believe there's a diocesan priest, but and I also the structure of the Vatican Observatory. There's 2 wings. There's one at Castel Gandolfo, on Vatican territory, but then the main telescope's actually in Arizona. Yeah. That's because the skies in Italy are not so great, and that's, as you can imagine, sort of a little bit separate operation. And I write for them. I edit their faith and science pages and a number of different things.
Well, I think the average person would say the Vatican Observatory, the main one, is in Arizona in the United States, and yet it's true. What is perhaps even more dramatically true is how the church sometimes gets a black eye about being against science, and yet if we really study the history of the church, there has been a great connectedness, as someone previously just said to me, universities really were spawned from the church's desire to learn and to share learning with others. And I think science also has, I think, a very good relationship. We've made the distinction, I think, between a love of science and the compatibility with faith versus what we might call, I think Pope John Paul called it scientism, where it becomes a new faith that replaces the gift of faith and the wonder. You and I talked earlier for this taping about how important it is to look at ultimate meanings, which science can lead us to, but can't give a full answer to. Mm-hmm. Tell us what draws you to that dialogue of faith and science.
Well, I think, first of all, there are quite a few very prominent scientists who have been people of faith. Gregor Mendel, is an example. He essentially founded genetics. He was a monk. He became the abbot of his monastery. But also Isaac Newton. This is generally not understood, but Newton spent. Faith was so important to him. He wrote more on faith and religion than he wrote on mathematics and physics, which is what he's known for. It generally hasn't been, his ideas were a little unorthodox, and so they were never published, and they remained in private hands essentially for 300 years. So we didn't know that much about his ideas, about his faith, but then in the past 50 years or so, those have come out, and we're learning much more about how important his faith was to him. Or just a simple and fun, more recent example is people who are familiar with the movie Hidden Figures, in the book by the same name, about the women who worked as computers for NASA in the early days of the space program. It is, generally not known that they were all involved in their churches. That's shown a little bit in the movie. There's a little scene where they're at a church picnic, but over and over again you'll find this. So people of faith do science, right?
Yeah.
Another thing that's interesting is a lot of the questions that we encounter, that you hear of related to faith and science that people bring up. Are we part of an infinitude of universes, a multiverse? Did life originate in a pool, a primordial soup? Are we formed by random happenstance and things like that? These ideas, it turns out, are very old. You can find these ideas back in the writings of people like Lucretius and stuff like that a couple thousand years ago. It doesn't mean that those ideas are wrong. We may figure out, how you get life out of some sort of soup of chemicals, right? But what it does mean is that the ideas are not new, and that means they are. It's not like, oh, this is some new thing, and how are we going to deal with this? These ideas have been around for a long time. Smart people within the church have addressed these. Talked about them, so on and so forth. And
what you're giving us, I have to say, Chris, you're giving us, I think, just a little flavor of how your faith and your thirst for scientific truth have come together and, in a sense, helped one another. And that's what I think our people so desperately need to hear, that faith is not opposed to science, science not opposed to faith, but we have to seek that compatibility. And I want to thank you. Gosh, the time goes by so quickly, and you've given us a little flavor of that. But thank you for that. And thank you for also allowing us to get a little more depth by reading your columns, and also by hearing more of this dialogue that will continue. And I want to thank all of you, the viewing audience, for being part of this edition of Conversation with Archbishop Kurtz. Please stay with us for the final segment for the January edition.